Hello, everybody. Welcome to Season 5, Episode 4 of Cap and Gown. I'm Rachel Phillips-Buck, VP for Student Success at Ferris Resources, joined by Matt Boisvert, our president. Hey, Matt.
Hi, Rachel.
How's it going?
It's good. I think there's a little carryover from last week where I'm having some technical difficulties. So,
oh dear. Well, we're back where we belong. Although I thought you were going to say we're having a little residual contention because as I was just explaining to our producer, Bailey, I root for the Giants in football. You root for the Cowboys in football. Z roots for the Eagles. And none of our teams like each other. So we were just talking about that. So I'm having some feelings about football. But
it was a rough weekend for all three of us.
That's always the best. It's really bad when one team has done great and the other two are like, shut it, So. Well, you guys, welcome to another episode of Cap and Gown. Super excited to be able to be with you today. We have Matt, yes, as my State of the Union partner, but also Dr. James Langford, who is our CIO at Ferris Resources. Super excited to have a conversation with him. And just talk about kind of the evolution of technology. So it's going to be really interesting. Great. Remember that our theme this year is curiosity. So that means that we are covering a curiosity book, which we finished last week. Matt and I are sharing curious facts with you and also telling you about our Google searches so you can get a little view into how the week's going and what we're thinking about. And then we're having lots of guests kind of around this idea of curious people. So very excited. Matt, will you start us off with some curiosity facts, please?
Yeah, well, I picked this one because you're talking with James. Okay, so I always have to say this, Rachel, because I want to give credit to National Geographic and their brain candy book.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Computers, Rachel, have come a long way.
Fact.
Are you ready?
Yes.
The very first computer mouse was made out of wood. Okay.
Do we know, does that have James and I were just talking about this, that little roly ball. You remember they used to have mice that had the ball that you would like undo the bottom.
Oh, yeah.
Remember that?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm going to have to find out more about this wood.
We need a picture of the wood mouse, but the first computer mouse was made of wood. The first programmable digital computer weighed 30 tons.
What?
And took up an entire room.
Wow. There's an old movie called Desk Set with Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy. Is that his name? I think so. Anyway, she is a librarian in charge of one of those computers. And it's like an entire floor is that computer. Yeah.
I think that James will have to correct me. I think that was at Stanford, but I don't know. I don't see a head nod yet. But today, the tiniest computer is the size of a grain of rice. That's where we are today.
I wonder what they use that for. I wonder if it's like medical.
Yeah.
Nice. Those were good today.
All right, good.
Good job. All right. Do you want me to do my Google searches first or you?
Go ahead.
Okay. My most recent Google search was there an earthquake in Abilene? The answer is yes, there was. Last night at 7:49, there was a 5.1 earthquake. I was taking my class. I was on the 7th floor in our office building, and this building was shaking, and it was very scary, and there was an earthquake. It's our third one like in the last 3 months, so that's interesting.
I'm sure when they built this building, they had to consider earthquakes, but no one really thought.
Not for real. Everyone was like, just cross that part off. We're not going to worry about that. Okay, my second search was Sloan Rialdi, who I've been watching the Barbecue Showdown or Barbecue Cook-Off. I don't remember what it's called on Netflix. She is a cook, a barbecue. What do they call them? Barbecue.
Chef?
They call them pit masters. Yeah. She's a pit master that I was curious to find out more about. My third search was the most obese states in the United States. My daughter and I were having a conversation, and she was making guesses about the most obese states. Number 1 is Mississippi. Number 2 is West Virginia. And number 3 is Arkansas.
Okay.
Also, I have a conversation with my daughter. I searched for 9/11 flag status. She was asking me if the flags would fly at half staff on that day. So we looked at that. And then finally, how many times has Bobby Flay won on Beat Bobby Flay? This is a competition where they have a chef come in and they cook against each other. And here's what's remarkable. He has won 261 times and lost 161 times. So his average is 61.8% he wins.
All right.
Competition. So that's interesting.
I mean, you got a 1 in 3 chance.
Yeah.
You go against him.
He's very tough.
All
right. What have you got?
All right. Well, I think you beat me this week.
Okay.
So I looked up Terlingua, Texas. This is weird because within 24 hours, 2 people I was talking to brought up Big Ben, and I was like, wait a minute, I've never been. I should go.
There's a chili cook-off there.
There is a chili.
I'm afraid that I talk about food a lot. Maybe I need to censor this a little bit. Everyone's gonna be like, Rachel really likes food. I do.
You do.
Yeah.
All right. After talking with Shauna, I looked up Split Rock Lighthouse, which we've used and featured in many of our PowerPoints. And
she just visited.
It's a beautiful lighthouse. I looked up Texas hawks, types of hawks in Texas.
Because
there's a good story on that.
Pair of hawks that fly around our building. We're trying to identify what kind they are.
And then I looked up ACU permit next lab because for the first time in 30 years, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has given permission for ACU and their next lab to move forward with their next generation nuclear research lab.
Pretty big news. It's kind of amazing. Yeah. All right. I don't feel like our searches were too weird this week. I feel like they're okay. Let's move on to State of the Union. All right. I told you last week I wasn't going to say the F word, FAFSA. This week I am. There's a very misleading article coming out of Inside Higher Ed. The title is FAFSA completion gap narrows to 2.5%, which I told you, and you were like, I don't believe it. And I was
the headline is
you shouldn't believe it. It is 2.5% behind the 2022-2023 cycle. But that is counting freshmen and returners. So basically, everybody who's in school had to go back and refill out the FAFSA, plus we have freshmen. For our freshmen only, the completion rates are still down by about 9.1%. And depending on your state, that's a little bit different. So remember, they're planning the sort of re-roll of the new FAFSA. It's going to be delayed until December. It was supposed to come out in October, December. But now they're talking about kind of how they're going to do that rollout starting very soon with 6 nonprofit colleges who are going to be partners. They're going to teach their students what to do. They're going to have access to the beta form for 600 students. They're going to see how that goes. And then they're going to do sort of a phased rollout depending on that, which perhaps they should have thought of before, but they didn't. Yeah. So, okay.
But still, I think really you can't just gloss over it. Down 9%, an unforced error, down 9%.
And our schools are for sure feeling that.
And you're going to see that go through for the next 4 years.
Yeah. Interestingly, there are some schools who the FAFSA rollout actually still very difficult for them, but in the reverse way. So, part of the problem was that schools couldn't set their budgets because they didn't know who's coming. So we have some schools that were like, we think we're going to yield this many students, and they have way fewer. But there are some schools that have way more than they expected to come, and they're having housing issues because they didn't know how to plan for it. So this idea that they're having to have novel solutions to how they're housing students. And Matt, this article, like what they're saying some schools are doing sounds horrible. So for some schools, they're placing upperclassmen in dorms designed for freshmen. Okay, that's not so bad. For some of them, they're housing 3 students in a res hall room that's designed for 2. That can be very difficult. We have seen before on on campuses where that impacts persistence and retention. Some students are getting discounts on their housing to make up for living in such close quarters. Webster State is double rooming students, but the way that they have their suites, 6 students are sharing 1 toilet and 1 shower.
That's what I was going to say. I mean, the issue isn't just like room space. It's your closet. It's being able to get ready in the morning. I mean,
Yeah.
I learned a lot about this just looking at one of our clients as they opened up their new res hall, and really great design. But then when I moved my daughter to tech, it was like, I mean, I can't even imagine if you threw another or 2 roommates into that closet, you know?
Pretty crazy. Also, at California State University, Monterey Bay, which is close to where our guest is today, they have a record number of freshmen, but it's really hard to find places for them to live. So they have a bunch of freshmen waitlisted. Normally, they would want everyone to stay on campus. In this case, they can't. Just really, really difficult. Like, they're putting students in some schools in the Holiday Inn Express, trying to figure out what's happening. So I think it's interesting because there's the shortfall of budget, which for sure is a hardship for schools because of the FAFSA debacle. But also there is the experience of having more students than you expected and not being prepared in a great way for that to happen. So both ends of that can be really difficult. And it will be interesting to see what happens to retention for those schools that don't have a place for their students to be.
Especially like this new commuter population, if you weren't really building in a strategy for how do we ensure community for these students that we've now moved off campus.
Yeah. Also, just so you all are aware, the gainful employment and financial value transparency reporting, there was a deadline for that. It now has been delayed for until January. So the Department of Education is like, hey, you guys are busy dealing with all the FAFSA stuff. We're going to move that reporting from October 1st to January 15th. Remember, this is the reporting around whether or not career training programs have a debt to earnings measure to prove that graduates make enough to pay off their federal student loans, and that at least half of them out earn typical workers in their state who only have a high school diploma. So Matt, we're kind of torn on this. I think there's a lot of value in a student understanding what they're borrowing versus what they can make. But, we serve a lot of schools that have very low earning jobs, things like ministers and teachers and that sort of thing. And so it'll be really interesting to see what happens there. We have a school that just cut their tuition for their Bachelor of Arts degrees in half. With this idea of like, if you're getting an art degree, you should pay less for it because you're going to end up making less money in the long run.
I think, well, I've talked about that for a long time, right? Just this unbundling on a campus, that tuition ought to be driven by the programs, that not every program is equal. And if you're earning your accounting degree and your first job is paying you $70,000, you could afford to pay more in tuition. That makes sense. Yeah. But for those who have a heart for service, they're not really in, success to them is not about salary, then it makes sense. And you're not paying your faculty as much as you would in the accounting. So I think you're going to see a lot of that.
It'll be interesting to see how that shakes out. Finally, in the State of the Union that never ends, there's a new Ohio bill that's going to allow universities to directly negotiate NIL deals with athletes and their agents. So there's a House Bill 660 introduced last week that no state university or private college would be allowed to prevent student athletes from being paid for their NIL, nor hiring an agent to negotiate such deals. So that's going to be very interesting. Schools, in turn, cannot be punished by the NCAA for allowing players to get paid for their NIL. So This is basically direct compensation to students around NIL. What's interesting is, sorry, go ahead.
No, keep going.
I was just going to say, it's interesting that a lot of universities are setting up NIL foundations to try to figure out, like, how are we going to get money directly to students from boosters or whatever that looks like. But this bill was introduced really late in the legislative session, so likely it will not get passed unless it's reintroduced in the next go around. So it's more kind of rehashing and going through what's going to be appropriate legally, which we've been asking for 2 years now.
Right. That's what I was trying to look up is when. So what year are we in this? We're 3 years in from a Supreme Court ruling.
More than 3 years. Yeah. More than 3 years after colleges were allowed to profit off their name. Yeah. So it's a 2021 U.S. Supreme Court ruling lifting the NCAA ban on education-related benefits to athletes. Pretty interesting. James and I are going to talk a little bit today about unintended consequences. But, when this happened 3 years ago, we were like, this is going to be so interesting to watch, just all of the dominoes that go when you make a big decision like this. So, okay, just a few more for you. In good news, college enrollment rates improved among high school class of 2022. In fact, in almost every demographic, these students, the class of 2022, went on to enroll in college more than the years before. So that's great. The only exception to that is the decline in high school students that come from low poverty areas. So in higher poverty areas, more students are going to college by like 3%. In lower, it's like a 1% drop. But also, Matt, something that we've seen recently is that the high school class of 2021 persisted in college at higher rates than students who graduated in 2020. And we're seeing that for a lot of our schools as we're looking at those students, that they are persisting and retaining at a higher level. So for students from the class of 2021, 86.7 returned for their second year of college, up from 85.6. So it's about a 1.5% increase. So we'll take it. Yeah. It will be very interesting to see how that plays out. And in fact, I've been reading a lot about a change in these college students' anxiety and depression, that it's having this slight dip from what we have seen in the last couple of years. Hopefully that means that there's going to be some relief for schools who are trying to figure out how to support that perhaps it's getting better. All right. 2 more. I could do a whole hour on this, but I'm not going to. But I wanted to talk to you about this because there's a study coming out of, it's a 2024 survey of college students conducted by YouGov on behalf of United Healthcare, which is about how parent interaction for freshmen in college changes their experience in college, which I really love. I would encourage everyone to read it. I think it's a really well done survey where they're asking college students every day, how much did you talk to your parents? What did you talk about? And how do you feel at the end of the day? And they're comparing if you talked to your parent and what you talked about to days that you didn't talk to your parent. So highly recommend you read the whole thing. But here's what I want to read for you. Let's see. First year students who have positive relationships with their parents are more likely to succeed. In a study of over 300 first-year college students, those who engaged with their parents regularly were more likely to have positive parent-student relationships, but only if the student reached out first. So if the parent is like, how's it going? How's it going? How's it going? That's not good. They don't like that. Don't do that, right? But if the student feels good contacting their parents and talking about things, then they have a positive response. So you should read this article. I think everyone should read it. I've been telling you that I heard something the other day that's like, when your kids are of a certain age, you're a dog parent, which is like every time you see them, you're like, hi, how's it going? Do you want to go do something? Like, how was your day? Right.
Right.
And then they get to be a certain age and you have to be a cat parent, which is like you're just kind of around and you can like brush their shoulder, but you just have to wait and see if they want to come and hang out with you. Rough.
For anyone who doesn't know, having my middle child start her freshman year, and it's hard,
It's hard. It's very hard. All right, and the last one for you is opinion piece that I'm gonna have to. We may actually do a whole cap and gown on this. I need to absorb it a little bit more. I haven't had as much time as I want to think about it, but it's the need. The title is the need to help students make meaning of painful disclosures. And this faculty member is talking about how years ago students would disclose really heartbreaking things to her in like a very weighty kind of expression. Like, I'm writing this paper, this awful thing has happened to me. And she's like, I've noticed recently that there's this sort of just throwing out of really awful things in class, kind of like off the cuff, just like, oh yeah, well, that thing happened to me, or this terrible thing happened to me. And she's like, part of the problem with this exposing, I forget what, Matt, you said the phrase, what did she call it? Oh, the allure of the reveal, that we're so used to revealing private things about ourselves, whether it's through social networks or because we have safe spaces and people are willing to listen to those things, that somehow throwing those things out, we sort of miss the meaning making of it. That we're not doing it in context of some bigger concepts. We're just saying like, yes, this thing happened to me. So historically, she's saying when students would disclose things to her, they would be contextualized. Like, this thing that we're talking about in class is a way for you to understand things that have happened to you before that have been traumatic, versus just telling people, here's something that happened to me, there it is, let's move on, right? So I think there's a lot of really good meat in that article, and definitely worth mulling over a little bit. And yeah, I just think it's very interesting.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the pendulum swing, thinking of for generations. So like my grandfather's generation, where they didn't talk about any of their trauma.
Yeah.
Like growing up in the Great Depression, World War II, a lot of serious challenges. They weren't talking about it, right? And so we're now, this is real. And just thinking about being in the classroom today and how different it is. My John story, I wonder, like, in that class, instead of having two students wait to talk to me after class, like, would my whole class have said what was on their mind that day?
Yeah.
Right? So
yeah, this is impacting me because this is my experience. And that's part of what she says, is that faculty have a hardship now because not only are they trying to sort of attend to the person who's disclosing, but also they're trying to attend to the entire class and understand how is the class experiencing this disclosure. And it just gets very, very complicated. So I think it's worth talking a little bit more about.
Yeah, I like that. I like it.
Well, that is the State of the Union. So thanks for joining me for that. I'm going to
Thanks, Rachel.
out and I'm going to bring in our guest, Dr. James Langford. Hey, James.
Good morning, or afternoon probably for you.
Yeah. Well, the nice thing is a lot of people listen to us on podcasts, so there's no telling where it is for them. Thanks for joining us. I said at the top of the show, you're our CIO for Ferris Resources, but I have to do a little self-disclosure and say, James, I think you've known me almost my whole life. You and my dad worked together in Manhattan at the International Mission. Can you just tell us, what is the International Mission? What did you guys do there?
We taught English as a second language to people from all over the world.
Yeah.
It was a really great experience.
So fun to think about, just growing up in that environment where when I was 6, knew people from all over. And we would do these really fun parties where everyone would bring a food from where they came from and have just gigantic potlucks of all of and wear, what you're used to wearing. And so that was really fun. I did dig up 2 pictures of me and my brother and your oldest son from back in the day. This is after you moved to Abilene. So that's, If you listen to us on podcast, you're missing out because this is a good one. And then also you guys would do a big Thanksgiving dinner for all the international students.
Yes.
And we would dress up like Native Americans. So
that's great.
It's been a long time.
I will say we went a long ways when we went from the kind of picture you just showed, where you're very young, and during those Thanksgiving holidays or Thanksgiving meals, we would take you guys across Central Park, walk through the park, and go to the Macy's Day Parade. And so having to keep up with 4 little ones going across, and we went from that to many years later when you were in Abilene studying for your LMFT and living with us.
Yeah.
That when we had family problems, we would say, okay, we don't know how to solve this. Let's take it to a higher power. Let's talk to Rachel.
And I'd be like, come together. Let's come together and talk about what we should do.
That's right.
Well, people who listen to me all the time know that I struggled when I was in college. And one of the reasons I was ultimately successful in college is because when I was a junior, you and Peggy let me come and live with you. Andrew was still at home. And so it just was such a grounding force. And I was thinking about hospitality. I don't know if I've ever told you the story, but when I first moved into your house, I had my like shower basket of stuff for the bathroom, and because I was used to living in the res hall. And so I took my shower basket and put it in the bathroom, kind of like tucked around in the corner. And when I came back, Peggy had emptied out one of the drawers and put all of my stuff in the drawer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I remember, talk about a sense of belonging, right? The difference between like, I'm just kind of here and I'm going to be shuffled up, and her being like, no, this is your drawer now. Here's where your things go. It was just very kind. It's a great experience of being invited. So thanks for that. You have to tell Peggy.
We loved having you.
Thanks. All right. So let me set the theme for what I want for us to talk about today. A couple of things. One thing is that it's so important to me that everybody know that the people who work at Farish Resources, we all come from a higher education background. So I think maybe with the exception of one person, everyone on our team has spent a lot of time in higher education. We understand the work, and you are no exception to that. You have a long list of accomplishments that we are going to go through that you've done. But I just felt like it was important for everybody to meet you as our CIO to understand the people behind the service and the technology we present. So thank you for agreeing to come on.
Happy to be here.
But the other thing is you have had such a long experience that you bring, I think, a lot of context and perspective to some of the technology things that are going on in our schools today. So I want to get into that. But I always ask our guest, what was your experience as a college student? Was there anything that was impactful or memorable, or anything that you especially think about as you think about being a college student?
I started right out of high school, part-time at a community college. And so on a semester, off a semester, on a semester, off a semester, working, that sort of thing, then off for a year, and then finally went to a residential school. And I just remember it was all very new and just didn't quite know how to make heads or tails of it, and thought, oh, I've got to study super hard. And so I spent a lot of time in the library at first. And then I realized I need money also, so I started working. But one of the most impactful things was John Willis inviting us over to his house. And he would invite a whole group of students over every week for a meal. And just being in somebody's home, we lived in what were the old barracks at that point, the old Army barracks that were still on campus. And just getting to go to somebody's home and have a meal was so impactful. Years later, when I was in charge of the ESL program, I remembered that. And when I found out that at Christmas time, students were going to be left with nowhere to go, international students, we put the word out, and people all over the community invited them into their homes. And at that time, I'd read a study that said most international students never visit an American home the whole time they're in the U.S.
That's incredible.
And it's a shame for both sides, for the students and for the people who miss out on that experience of having somebody from another culture live with them.
Yeah, that's so interesting, James. I was thinking about when I was in school, every Wednesday night, I would come over, even before I lived with you guys, I would come over and Peggy would be like, just bring whoever you want. We're just Wednesday night, we're going to have dinner. And I learned a great phrase from her, which was, we can always add more water to the soup. So the idea that if it's 4 or it's 25, it doesn't make any difference. We can always, there's always more food. What's important is having people over and having that experience of hospitality and fellowship and all of that. So I love that piece. So let's talk about the arc of your professional life, because you started in higher education in 1985 and went all the way through 2014. And I set the stage for that to say, years ago, you and I were talking about the uptick in technology resources that were needed on a campus. And we went back and looked at the budgets for technology on campus from like the beginning of time all the way through, I think it was 2012 when we looked at it. So I actually have a slide about that. The first piece is being able to see, sorry, can we go back one more slide? Okay, so the first piece is looking at the dependence on technology. So 1958, there was at our campus that we were at, there was one IBM accounting machine, which I don't even know what that is. In 1984, academic computing, that section, like the department, was formed. And then in 1985, the telecommunication department was formed. Between 1992 and 94, you can see all of the things. So we've got technical service, academic computing, administrative computing, information technology, just all of the things during that time period. And the budget looks like this. So if we look from the beginning of, when the college is founded, it's like no, Matt was like, what could it have been? It was like at some point, maybe they had Xerox machines. I don't really know. And then it moved up to like 6 million by 2006. And I looked at EDUCAUSE today. I think for this school, the budget is about 15 million now for technology. So that, just to give us a context of all the things that happened really in the time between you started and then you left.
I remember, Rachel, the director of finance, or I'm not sure the exact title, but the director of academic computing at that time went to him and said, we need another VAX computer, one of the older mini computers that were used. And he said, after some negotiation, finally said, okay, we'll buy you another computer, but this is the last one you'll ever get.
Little did he know.
He was good at finance, but wasn't much of a prophet.
Well, you were saying today, in the context of like, there's always something new under the sun and everybody's freaking out about it. And what are we going to do about this technology? You were saying that you actually remember teaching faculty how to use word processors and mice, right?
Yeah, I went from, I was first in the classroom, and your dad actually got a Macintosh when we were still working together. And I thought, why do you need that? But I don't understand. So he gave me his old Apple IIe when he got the Mac, and I tried to play with it some, but didn't have much luck. So when I started teaching at the university, I had to create a syllabus. So, well, how do I do that? I don't have a typewriter here, so word processor. How do I keep up with grades and classes? Oh, I need to learn how to use a spreadsheet. And that sparked an interest in the technology itself, not necessarily at that point how it applied to technology, but how it applied to education, but how it applied to the management of education.
Yeah.
And then I started, I don't know if you remember SimCity, where you build so that was one of the first things I used in the classroom. And then as my interest in technology grew, they opened up a position for, I think it was coordinator or director of instructional technology. So it was, how do we use technology to teach and learn, and some of that for management and some of that actually helping the students learn.
Yeah. So the idea, though, even then was there are disruptive technologies, and we're talking about, we were talking about like spell check, There's technologies that students are going to get their hands on, and it's going to ruin education as we know it, and it will never be the same. And it seems like that's just the way that people respond to technology always. Has that been your experience?
It has that, and the application, the misapplication sometimes of technology. I remember one of the earliest ones was the rush to use PowerPoint. That the faculty were going to use PowerPoint because this is the computer generation and we need to keep them interested. Well, unfortunately, the technology wasn't mature at that point. I mean, PowerPoint was, I guess, but the projectors were dim enough that you had to turn the lights out. So what that meant is instead of students looking at a teacher and interacting directly, everybody's looking at the screen or napping through it because it wasn't that fascinating, actually.
Yeah.
So it was an effort by faculty to use technology in a way that would interest students, but it had the opposite effect.
It's so funny as you're saying that. I'm just going through the experience that even just I've had in my educational career. When I started, we just had blackboards. When I was in elementary school, we were only using blackboards, right? And then we moved to overhead projectors, which was huge for like you would have your transparencies. And some people don't even know, like you would have like your whole stack of overhead transparencies that you would use to teach. And then we think about PowerPoint. And I remember early PowerPoints when there were so many animations and clip art and like it just was so, it was crazy and you couldn't pay attention. And then James, you oversaw at ACU iPhones, this kind of initiative of when the iPhone came out. Can you explain what that was?
Yeah, when the iPhone first came out, we thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting if every student, every incoming freshman got an iPhone? And so we worked with AT&T and Apple, and we set it up, and parents brought their kids in. And it was such a novel thing that everybody is going to have their own phone, and it's going to be this fancy new iPhone. So we did that, and then it was a big team effort, and I was mainly involved in the let's provide technology to them. So we created a bunch of different web apps at that point for students and teachers to use. And so we tried to integrate those into the classroom. So we did a survey tool, and I think it was called Nano Tools at that time. And that's before you could buy one. So teachers could do a survey in the class. I'm not sure it took all kinds of network adjustments to get that many phones working at the same time, especially in a large survey class. So I'm not sure how much more effective it was than people just raising their hands to answer the questions, because you got percentages and bar graphs and all of that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But we noticed then that, of course, there weren't that many uses for the phone at that point. So social media was not a thing. Not as ubiquitous as it is today. So, but you end up with students looking down at a screen instead of looking at each other. And so the technology that we talked about previously became a barrier to personal connection. I mean, you think about a teacher in a classroom, what's the most valuable thing that can happen there?
Yeah.
I mean, direct interaction, challenging of opinions, encouragement to think in a different way, not just transferring information. And so we found that was happening as well, or that the technology didn't work as well as we wanted, and so it became another barrier. So you would talk about heads up at this point?
Well,
is that relevant?
Yeah, I do want to talk about that. I was thinking about what you said to me earlier about how so often people think technology is going to be the solution in and of itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
That you can just buy a technology or implement a technology and then you're good to go. And I was saying a couple of weeks ago in Cap and Gown for AI that if we think about the iPhone and how little people knew about how it's going to change our brain, how it's going to change our connections, how it's going to change all of that. And we just gave it, I mean, I'm not talking about the iPhone initiative at this university, but I'm just saying in general, we just all got iPhones and we're like, let's make up rules for how we're going to use this. And sometimes those rules are bad. You know what I mean? Sometimes you're like, had we been more thoughtful about what actually should happen, we would have done this a little bit differently. So I think the context for being thoughtful about how you use technology, and my favorite schools to work with are the ones that have the people and the programs and the processes worked out, and then we just fit technology under it and we make them more effective and efficient at what they're already doing really well. But it's always so nice to be like, oh, you guys have thought through all of the things, now let's use technology to make it more efficient. Go ahead.
I will also say that I think on our iPhone initiative, we had very thoughtful people, faculty, and other educational technology people like George Salzman and Bill Rankin, for example, that headed up. They were trying to be very thoughtful about how the technology is used and not just slap it on. But until you're actually using all of that technology, there's no way to predict what the unintended consequences will be. So I think we made a really good run at it. I just think that the allure of the screen is so hard to overcome, and you just have to, you almost have to jump in and try and tinker a little bit to understand what the consequences are going to be.
Yeah. I mean, it is true that we then could not have imagined how smartphones and social networking, it affects students in the classroom today. We just couldn't. Right. Okay. So I do want to talk about Heads Up because it's a great example of, I don't know, James, it's like assessing some problem with technology that you've already said, like we now have students, everyone has an iPhone, everyone's looking at it all the time. And it wasn't social networking. It basically was like a big deal because you could access the internet on your phone. That's why it was a big deal, right? You could just Google whatever you wanted to back then. So you were like, I need to figure out a way to use this technology to engage students in what is the richest part of the class experience. So can you talk about Heads Up?
Sure. Actually, a faculty member at ACU said, wouldn't it be interesting if we could use technology somehow to get students to think in new ways? He said, in my classes, some students are always, they're optimistic about any kind of scenario you lay out. They're blue sky thinking. Other students are always negative. Some find the problem, some look for solutions. And so he told me about a researcher, Edward de Bono, who has the 6 thinking hats. Exactly.
Yeah.
And so the idea behind Heads Up was using that or any other number of frameworks. Let's have a way to assign these kind of points of view or tendencies of ways of thinking to students and have them go through a series of those. So first you're going to think about what are the facts about the situation. Next, you're going to think, what are the possible problems that could happen? Next, you're going to think about what are all the benefits that we could get from this? And our effort was to just have them look at the phone, get their assignment, and then look up and have a group discussion. So it was a way of encouraging group discussion, not using a phone instead of the conversation. So I think we had some good results. Didn't always work the way we wanted it to, but I think the idea was sound, that you're not going to get them out of their hands. And so let's try to use them in a way that actually helps.
Well, there's a foundational philosophy to that, which we really embrace at Ferris, which is technology cannot replace people and their interactions with other people. And so I think about, from the beginning of time, I have been very bossy, perhaps to a fault, about we do not send automatic emails to students. Emails do not need to come from technology somewhere. It needs to come from a person that I can come to their office and say, please help me, I'm having difficulty, right? And that's that same philosophy, that this is not technology and students, this is me and students, and I want technology to support my efforts there. And so, whenever we have conversations about the technology that we build, our main focus is people in higher education love students. They don't love technology. So we have to figure out how to facilitate spending more time with students, looking them in the eye and helping them with their problems, instead of saying, you have to learn this technology, you've got to go to a class for 6 months just to be able to use it, right? That is not what we're trying to do with the things that we're building at Ferris.
Right. I think about going to the doctor's office and you're filling out the same forms all over again, or you're taking time with the doctor to go over conditions or medications or something, and that can be done offline to enhance and enable the time that you spend with the doctor. And I think the same thing is true here.
Yeah.
If a student needs help, then in whatever area, the practitioner can pull that information up first and not deal with all of that background information first. They can look the student in the eye and talk with them.
Yeah. You and I also share the love of something else, which is systems. I think about it always in terms of relational systems, who's connected to who and what powers there and all of that kind of thing. But you've applied that in a couple of different ways, thinking about English or languages, thinking about how you dive into, we just got our SOC 2, which is a huge accomplishment. Yes. Can you tell everybody what the SOC 2 is?
Well, it's auditing standard. It's you select your service criteria that you're interested in. It's primarily a U.S.-based attestation, not a certification. It's called attestation. And an auditor comes in and says, so are your systems secure? Do you have firewalls up and web application firewalls and that sort of thing? Is it accessible? Do you keep up? Are you monitoring your systems to be sure that they're available all the time? So availability, processing integrity. When you say you're processing information in a certain way, are you actually doing it? So several principles that you choose, and then you apply controls to those. You say, well, yes, we are protecting our systems. Well, prove it. And so the controls are the ways that you give evidence that you are protecting your systems. And so the auditor comes in and says, you say you are, but are you really? And we went through an extensive process with that. They looked at our controls, and we got our first SOC 2 attestation. So very happy about that.
Yeah, it's been years and years in the making. I bring it up now just to say, that has been, our theme of curiosity, right, this year. That whole process really is being curious about how things work together, who does what, when do they do those things, how are they connected to each other. And I don't know, James, when you started on that process years ago, did you feel like, I know the plan for the next 4 years and here's what we're going to do? Or is that sort of a stumbling through, learning as you go? I don't mean stumbling. I know you weren't stumbling, but
I stumbled a lot. Yes.
Marching through, learning as you go kind of process for you.
Yeah, it was, okay, what do they mean by controls? I mean, I'd been involved in development before, and lots of things surrounding technology, infrastructure, but having to prove to somebody else that we were following best practices, or that we weren't following best practices and we didn't realize it. So just jumping in and saying, let's take one control and let's look at it. And after a while, it all started to make sense. I mean, the SOC 2 attestation is really about, you're taking a shortcut to best practices. And I mean, shortcut in a good way. You're not reinventing all of those best practices. the controls that an auditor wants you to have in place are using those best practices. So by working on the SOC 2, we were able to learn at first the best practices, dip our toe in the water, add one more, add one more, add one more. And gradually we saw it's not just a bunch of check boxes that we need to fill. This is actually going to make us better.
Yeah.
And I can unequivocally say that our systems are better, and not just technology, but it helps all across the organization. Our processes for hiring people, for onboarding, offboarding, all of those things became better because we're using best practices.
Yeah.
Makes sense we would be better.
Well, there's a parallel there that we see so often when we're doing technology implementation on campus. So two things come to mind. One is in the early days, 15 years ago when we first started, we had this technology and it's infinitely customizable. You can do whatever you want. You can have whatever care areas you want, and whatever people, and whatever email templates, and whatever you want. And in the early days, we would say to a school, well, here you go. Here's all the technology. What do you want to do with it? And it's because we didn't know the best practices because we hadn't done it that long, right? So we would say some things, here's what we would suggest you do. But mostly we were talking to schools about how customizable a thing is. And at some point, we started to say, like, actually, we do know how you should set this up. And so instead of a bunch of building blocks and just like throwing Legos at you, right? And being like, yeah, do whatever you want. It's going to be great. What we were hearing from schools is we don't have the time or the capacity to A, become experts in these processes, or B, put the Lego blocks together. I might be able to pop off one and put on another, but I can't put all of this together. It's not my job. My job is to be with students. And so then we moved to this piece where we're like, it is customizable. If you are the kind of person who wants to take all the Lego blocks and build it the way you want, you can for sure do that. But we're going to deliver to you an out-of-the-box solution that you can use now with little tweaks instead of just throwing the Lego blocks at you, which, I like a little bit of chaos and freedom. I have been very surprised to see how many people are like, please tell me the best. Over 15 years, what's the best way to set it up? And we say like this, and they're like, thank you for that. Right. So James, just thinking about like this process of SOC 2, if someone's like, yeah, go figure out what the best way to do that. It's so much wasted time.
It is. Yes.
Yeah.
And we used a software system called Drata, and there are others, Vanta, and several of these kinds of programs out there. But they guide you through and help you know what policies you need, and then are constantly monitoring you to see if you're following those principles. And then our auditor, we will have a continuous audit after a certain period of time. And so we will constantly be audited. So it's not a matter of we have to wait once a year and then go back and try to correct everything we did. We're going to be constantly audited, continuously audited.
Yeah, that feedback, right? So that you continually. So James.
Yeah, and I love what you guys do. I say you guys because you're a section of the company, of going in and consulting with people, and you're figuring out the same way we used to do with faculty. What is it you're actually trying to accomplish?
Yeah.
Let's not start with the technology. Let's start with the problem at hand.
That's right.
And then let us help you adjust based on best practices, the technology to meet the goals that you have. And here's the best way to go about doing that.
Well, my favorite question to ask is, what is the problem we are trying to solve? Because a lot of times you will have somebody come to you and say, this is what we want. And I'm like, I don't think that's what you want.
That's right.
What the problem is you're trying to solve. Oh, if that's what you're trying to solve, this is the way that we can do that really easily.
Yeah.
So it's just getting the cart. I always say this wrong. Cart before the horse. That's right. The horse.
Yeah.
Cart before the horse. Yeah. The other thing, James, that process makes me think about is you and I have this in common, which is we are able to take to not be able to see all the steps yet, but to take steps forward and be adaptable to what comes. And you actually at your university created the first Maker Lab, which is around this idea of tinkering. Can you talk a little bit about why that's important and kind of how that came to be, how you think of it?
Yeah, I remember years ago you were teaching a class to some students and you wanted to illustrate different personality types. And so you invited a panel of people to come in, and I was one of the panelists. And you asked us several questions, and we all had different personality types, and you knew that because you knew all of us. And one of the questions was, do you always finish the projects that you start? And one of the other people said, oh, no. I said, yes, absolutely. I don't start a project if I can't finish it. I think through all the steps, I count the cost, and if I can't do it, I don't start it. And I said, oh, all the time. How do you even know if it's worth doing if you haven't started,
Yeah.
haven't tried something? And the great thing about technology now is, again, way back, we would, if we wanted to implement a new system, we would have to find out from the software maker what the specs were, what the requirements were. We had to project use into the future. We had to order a server, get the right specs, install it, set up the network. I mean, on and on. Be sure power supplies were there, network plug wires were pulled to the right place. Now, because of cloud computing, we can spin up a server in 5 minutes. I can have one running. So it allows the technology does allow us to do a lot of things that we wouldn't have been able to do otherwise, to tinker. And that's kind of going back to the Maker Lab. The Maker Lab encourages you to tinker and try something. You want to do a 3D print? Okay, go ahead and try it. If it doesn't work, then you can try again. But that's only possible when the systems are in place and the materials and the processes are there to let you do that. So I think we're in a great time as far as technology. We can sandbox off to the side a new way of accomplishing whatever within our system and try it out. And if it doesn't work, then we back up. Or more often than not, we learn what does work and what doesn't, and then we apply that to the production systems.
Yeah. I am sorry, but whoever thought of the phrase sandbox, that was genius, right? So for those of you who don't know, sandbox is like not your real technology, but we're just going to have a sandbox over here for you to just play in and see how it works and all of that. It's such a great way to approach really anything, to be able to say, this doesn't count. What we're doing here doesn't count yet. We're just learning and playing and being curious and seeing about how things work. And I think, to tie a bow on this conversation, having a sandbox in whatever you're doing, a place for you to play and be curious and wonder and tinker, in conjunction with best practices, people who can say, I understand the full picture, and if you will stick with me and follow these steps through, I'm going to lead you to that big picture. Those two things in conjunction are so powerful, because you have to be able to have the experience of learning in your sandbox. But it's really helpful to have somebody that says, I have the steps down and follow me on this iterative journey, and I can take you to a place where we need to go, right? And the safety to be able to play like that, I think, is so important. That makes me happy to think about. Just like pick a thing and play around with it and see what happens. And James, you and I have talked for a long, long time about oftentimes the things that are remarkable in one industry come from transplants from another industry, right? So you have a person who's really good at this thing, and then they come into a new space and they say, why aren't you guys doing this in higher education? And that innovation is how you get great ideas that are sticky for people to pursue. So I need to figure out a way to have sandboxes in my life. I think that's I always like to do action items, figure out a place where you can go and play and be curious and learn new things. I really love that. All right. Well, is there anything else that I didn't ask you about that you want to talk about?
I think we covered it.
It's such a great perspective of there's nothing new under the sun. We always have new technologies and that sort of thing, but our responses to them in terms of trying to figure out how to use them well and how to be innovative, I think is a continual learning process for all of us. So thank you so much for joining me on Cap and Gown. It was good to have you. And
thank you for having me.
yeah, for sure. Everybody have a good day.